Hey guys, during the Gilded Age, we know that there was all sorts of problems caused by the rapid industrialization of the United States. Did you ever stop to think about what exactly those problems were and how normal Americans realized they even existed? Well, stick around because that's what we're going to talk about today on Mr. E's Classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today we're going to talk about the drive for reform, or how the progressive movement really got started. What exactly are we going to talk about? Well, here's our question. What problems did society face and how were they exposed to the public? That's what we're going to get into today. So what exactly is progressivism? Progressivism was a movement mostly of the middle class at the turn of the 20th century, right around 1900. Progressives, people who kind of pushed this idea of progressivism, really wanted to try to get the government involved to try to fix a lot of the economic and social problems that were caused by industrialization and urbanization. Most progressives were motivated by religion. There's this idea called the social gospel. The social gospel was basically the idea that you could improve society by trying to apply what was called Christian principles to living. Basically, they thought that if we could live through good works, charity, justice, stuff like that, that we could make our society much like what was viewed as the kingdom of heaven by a lot of Christians at the turn of the century. Progressivism had 5 goals, and as we go through this unit, you're going to see these different goals pop up. Goal number 1 was to reduce political corruption. Goal number 2 was to try to limit monopolies and trusts, or you could simply say limit big business. Goal number 3 was all about moral reform. Goal number 4 was to improve working and living conditions, mostly for the lower income classes. And lastly, goal number 5 was women's suffrage, or the woman's right to vote. This is just kind of a little bit of a side note about progressivism, but there are 3 presidents that you really need to know under progressivism. The first one was Theodore Roosevelt. He was the first true progressive president. He was a Republican. The second is a guy named William Howard Taft, also a Republican. And the last true progressive president, number 3, was Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat. An interesting thing about progressivism is that it didn't necessarily fall along political party lines. So how did we even get on this path to progressivism? A lot of the ideas of progressivism were kind of pushed forth by a group of journalists known as muckrakers. Muckrakers are people, usually journalists, that use some sort of kind of sensationalized investigative reporting to uncover problems within society. Interestingly enough, the term muckraker was actually coined by Theodore Roosevelt himself. Roosevelt realized that there was a lot of nasty stuff that needed to be exposed in American society. He kind of linked it to mucking out a horse stall or getting rid of the manure where the horses lived. Roosevelt saw muckraking as a necessary evil. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it's something that had to be done if America was going to improve itself. For the rest of this lecture, we're going to look at some notable muckrakers at the turn of the 20th century. Probably one of the most well-known muckrakers was an author named Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair kind of came to fame by writing a book called The Jungle. The Jungle described some of the nasty things that were happening in the meatpacking industry, where most of the food supply was coming from at the day. What Sinclair did was he went undercover and he actually went to work at some of these meatpacking plants, and he used his experiences while he was there as a worker to write his book. Now, the book itself is actually kind of a love story, but Sinclair weaves in all the graphic, gory details of what he uncovered while he was working there. Most people started to read this book, kind of put 2 and 2 together and realized that the things that they were reading about that were so disgusting were things that were actually happening with their food. The next notable muckraker was a woman named Ida Tarbell. Tarbell wrote a series of stories that became known as the History of Standard Oil. It was a 19-part series that ran in a magazine of the day called McClure's Magazine. Tarbell basically uncovered kind of the nasty shadiness of big business practices of the day. She essentially exposed how these businesses were not benefiting society at all they were doing was basically making rich people even richer. Lincoln Stevens wrote a book called The Shame of Cities. Stevens set out to uncover the corruption of city politics. And because of what he uncovered and what he wrote about in The Shame of Cities, people started to really question what was happening in city governments across the country. Eventually, this led to some serious reforms within those governments that benefited pretty much everybody who lived within those cities. You should be familiar with this last muckraker, a guy named Jacob Riis. We've already talked about Riis. Riis was a photojournalist. He told stories through pictures. He wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. He went through cities, through the tenements and kind of the slum areas, and took pictures of the nasty living conditions of the economic poor class. Eventually those pictures got put together in a book, and he went around and basically told the stories of what he heard to what was a new emerging middle class. People saw this and were kind of appalled, and eventually that led to some serious changes and some help for those incredibly downtrodden, incredibly poor people living in the cities. There's a quick introduction to progressivism and kind of what started the drive to change things. Here are a couple quick takeaways from this section. Takeaway number one was that progressivism was a social movement that wanted to fix the problems caused by industrialization and urbanization. Takeaway two is that progressivism had 5 goals: to reduce corruption, limit big business, moral reform, improve living and working conditions, and women's suffrage. And the final takeaway was that muckrakers led the charge to expose the bad parts of American society. There you go, ladies and gentlemen, the drive for reform. Hopefully you paid attention, you got some great notes out of that, and as always, be ready because there's probably going to be a quiz. Ladies and gentlemen, until next time, like I always say, don't ever stop learning.